back to Snippit Sports Science. Happy New Year to everyone, and Happy New Year to you too, Jared.
Thank you, Chris. Happy New Year to you.
How was the festive season?
Oh, pretty excellent.
Yeah,
how was yours?
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you.
Excellent.
So thanks for listening to us all of the last year. We're pretty proud of ourselves being able to produce a weekly podcast for everyone on some articles of interest to ourselves, but hopefully to yourself. And also thanks to eliteform.com, who's sponsoring our podcast and help just improving the quality of our service little by little.
Yeah, absolutely. We're very excited to be moving into a new year with Snippit, and we're almost up to an entire year of content for the listeners, which I'm as you said, I'm proud of us for doing that. I didn't know we'd get this far into podcasting.
Definitely. It's a good journey thus far. The article today that we're going to review is one by Christian Cook et al., producing some wonderful papers in the testosterone and elite athlete population. And what we're going to actually review his paper on is female athletes and around the menstrual cycle and a linkage to motivation and muscle power.
Yeah, another excellent paper by Cook and colleagues looking at something very near and dear to our heart, which is we believe that female training has largely been done incorrectly throughout all of human history, as it's been based on research and traditions from male literature and people's experiences training males, and really hasn't been done based on female biology at all.
That's right. And as Jared said, traditionally we train female athletes as male versions, really, and that's incorrect. So this paper here really highlights a little bit of background behind females and testosterone and what you're able to achieve taking these things into consideration.
Yeah, so they're looking at several different dimensions within this paper, aren't they, Chris? They're looking at elite versus sub-elite, different phases within the menstrual cycle, as well as the different effects between the relationships between testosterone, peak power, and that motivation to train.
And also the role of potentiation prior to a test.
Right, and how those different characteristics might affect each other. Is PAP, post-activation potentiation, is it more effective for elite athletes versus sub-elite? Is it more effective during different phases of the menstrual cycle?
That's exactly right. And we know this evidence is obviously out there for male athletes, but does it truly exist for the female cohort?
Not as far as I'm aware, no.
No.
All right, so getting into this paper, can you tell us a little bit about the athletes that they recruited?
With respect to the participants, as Jared alluded to earlier, it was really elite versus sub-elite. For a total of 22 athletes that recruited, 6 were competing at a national level, so these were the elite athletes, 13 at a club level, and 3 at a recreational level. And these were taken across one or more of 4 sports, such as figure shaping, netball, soccer, and triathlon. These athletes, on average, would train between 2 to 5 days a week, and they involved a mixture of general and sport-specific sessions, including some endurance components. And the other thing is here that they had at least 2 years of resistance training history.
Right, and they were training 2 to 5 days per week, typically, and so they were all quite well-trained athletes, even the recreationally trained. There were 3 of them that were recreationally trained, 13 at the club level, and 6 at the national level, which we consider elite.
That's right. And all the participants were actually contraceptive-free for a minimum of 6 months. And furthermore, their T values for each of the athletes within that normal physiological range for healthy women, which was 40 to 300 picomoles per litre, which suggests that no anabolic doping agents were taken by these athletes.
Very important variables for this type of study, certainly. So this study was conducted over an incredibly long term. They looked at 3 different menstrual cycles in each of the women, which would be a minimum of about just under 90 days. But because of the differences in the timing, I'm sure it took a long time to conduct this study, especially with all the competition and training demands of particularly those elite athletes. This would have been an incredibly demanding study to accomplish.
Yeah, definitely.
This was a 2-group longitudinal study design that involved a combination of observational, quasi-experimental, and experimental testing. The athletes self-collected their saliva samples in the morning within 15 minutes of waking up, and definitely before breakfast, on days 7, 14, and 21 across 3 consecutive menstrual cycles to assess the basal salivary testosterone concentrations. Day 1 was the reported start of menses, recorded 30 minutes after awakening. A short motivational questionnaire was completed after the saliva collection. On 2 occasions on each menstrual cycle day, days 7, 14, and 21 that we previously mentioned, the athletes also performed a short physical stress test in the morning at 0900 hours to assess the salivary testosterone reactivity and a strength-based post-activation potentiation stimulus in the afternoon at 1500 hours to examine changes in cycling peak power. All menstrual cycle repeats were randomized. The study protocols and variables are outlined in Table 1, which I encourage the readers to open up the article, as always, and follow along with us in the article as we're going through it. And you can look at Table 1. It's an excellent display of when the measures were taken throughout 3 different cycles, the times they were taken on, and the days that they were taken on. It really shows that quite clearly. The subjects were familiarized with all procedures across 2 sessions, and their 90% 1 repetition maximum load for the post-activation potentiation exercise, which was a leg press, was calculated. So could you go into a bit more detail on the physical stress testing and PAP protocols for us, Chris?
Definitely. The other one also is that motivational testing.
Oh, yeah, very important.
Yeah, so this is just the measurements of motivation to train and compete, which was recorded in a training diary. To capture some of these elements, each athlete was instructed to rate their current motivational state on a Likert scale, which was from the number 1, so 1 where they have no motivation to train or no desire to compete, up to 7 where they are extremely motivated to train or they feel extremely competitive.
Right, and I'd like to point out that the authors indicate here that single-item behavioral ratings are often used to assess athletic populations in sport due to how easy they are to apply and the interpretation with low intrusiveness and the high compliance from the athletes.
It's just easy to do.
Exactly, and personally, I think that it is a very good way to assess motivation. Ask someone 1 to 7 how motivated you are. I've previously been criticized for wanting to include those types of measures in my own research, and so I've used the previously validated profile of mood states now instead of using single-item behavioral ratings, but I personally think that single-item behavioral ratings are an exceptionally good way to assess those measures that are much more difficult to quantify with a machine.
Moving on to a bit more detail about the physical stress testing and the PAP protocols. The physical stress test was essentially a warm-up on a cycloergometer. So in this case, it was a watt bike. And they had 3 minutes of increased intensity, about 125 to 150 watts, and then a maximal 10-second effort. They followed this by having a recovery period of a total of 10 minutes duration, of which saliva was collected 5 minutes before and after the test. So once again, the physical stress test was essentially a 10-second effort. The PAP assessment, this was once again done on a watt bike. They did 2 6-second efforts with a 1-minute recovery between efforts. So at this point, at 9 o'clock in the morning, they do their stress test. As I said here, it was a 10-second effort. They came back in the afternoon at 3 o'clock. They did their cycle test, which was 2 6-second efforts on the watt bike. They waited 20 minutes. And at this point here, they did their PAP stimulus or a control. In this case, the PAP stimulus was 3 by 3 repetitions at 90% 1 RM on a 45-degree leg press machine, or alternatively a control trial. Then they had another 15 minutes of recovery, and then the groups repeated the 2 6-second cycle tests on the watt bike.
Yeah, so a really solid warm-up there and good methodology for trying to achieve a genuine peak power rather than, if someone just jumped onto a cycloergometer and had to go for 6 seconds, it's, they're not going to get their true peak power out of that effort. You need a quality warm-up like this and the other procedures that they've used. I'd also like to point out that the authors have recognized the potential effects that temperature, hydration, and macronutrients could have on potential athletes, and so they've gone to an effort to control each of those, maintain the temperature at 20 to 24 degrees Celsius, limiting the water to a maximum of 500 milliliters ad libitum, and asking the athletes to cease eating 1 hour prior to the testing.
And as Jared said earlier, this was done over 3 menstrual cycles. So what this enabled the researchers to do is just randomize it totally. Therefore, the subjects across 3 cycles would just do their waking tests, and they'd get an opportunity to do the PAP or the leg press, and the third one would be the control, where they would actually just rest in between the 2-cycle test and the retest period time.
Right. So this is across approximately 3 months, coming in 3 times per month for those 3 months. 9 times these athletes have volunteered their time and effort for the research.
Yeah. And let's dig into the results, Jared.
Absolutely. So to recap, the main aims of this study were to determine whether the basal concentrations of salivary testosterone vary across the menstrual cycle, looking at that day 7, 14, 21. 2, to determine whether the self-reported motivation to train and compete parallel the changes in basal T concentrations. So as testosterone changes over the menstrual cycle, if it changes, does motivation change with the testosterone as well? Number 3, to determine whether the salivary testosterone responds to a set physical stressor and cycling power after a PAP stimulus also differ across the menstrual cycle, similar to the salivary testosterone and the motivation. And number 4, to determine whether the magnitude of change in any of these outcomes differs between the elite and non-elite female athletes.
From an outset, when you look at the basal salivary testosterone concentrations, there's 2 things that really stick out here. One, at day 14, that you tend to have higher testosterone concentrations. And the other thing that really sticks out here is there's a significant difference between elite and non-elite athletes in respect to that elite athletes have higher testosterone concentrations across all 3 testing points, that's 7, 14, and 21. But more so at day 14, there's a huge peak, a really significant increase in testosterone from within the elite group, but also when you compare them against the non-elite athletes.
Yes, massive peak. 3-fold greater testosterone on day 14 than on the other days. And yeah, similarly, about a 3-fold difference between elite and non-elite. It's quite remarkable how, on the elite, there almost looks like there's not even a peak. They don't have that flow in testosterone, whereas the elite do have large increases in testosterone.
And this follows then straight onto the motivational state. A lot of work out there, in male environments links testosterone concentrations to motivation, aggression, determination, competitiveness. And here, once again, that you could actually see a similar result where there was a difference between elite and non-elite, and more so at that day 14 point where there's that increase in motivation to train, that motivational state to train and compete on that day 14.
Absolutely. There appears to be a strong relationship there. And to me, this is such an interesting sort of chicken and egg story. There's the question of, is that what makes an elite person? Is they have these different hormonal profiles which result in different perceptual experiences, which result in different behaviors and causes them to become elite people? Or is it a merit of the training that they've done has chronically improved their biology, their ability to produce testosterone? Could be improved by the fact that they've been doing good training for years.
That's so true.
Exactly. Maybe it's a bit of a vicious positive feedback sort of cycle. You sit on the couch, you get better at sitting on the couch.
Yeah. And it's also could be a product of your environment. Do you have that supportive environment which helps create those type of hormonal profiles? We definitely know that if you're in a negative situation where people are quite cautionary, negative feedback, that has no good response for testosterone. So if you support a family that helps support your sporting wishes and so forth, that helps drive that hormonal process, which then you're more willing to go play sport. You have parents which are very encouraging and supportive. So that just has that positive feedback loop, which continues to go.
Absolutely. If a person is constantly beaten down and never supported, how could you expect them to succeed, become elite?
Correct. On to the next point about the salivary testosterone responses to the physical stress test. They revealed that their pre-test salivary T had similar trends as we had obviously observed in the basal and also the motivational states, such that it was higher on day 14 versus day 7 and 21. With a further difference between the elite and the non-elite women. The stress testing promoted a positive change in salivary testosterone on all 3 testing occasions in the elite group and the non-elite group, but it was much bigger for the elite cohort.
Right, so not only is there an increase on day 14 of that basal awakening testosterone and motivation to train, but there's also a greater response of testosterone. So it's not just greater baseline, they also get a larger increase in testosterone upon training on day 14.
And that's part of the reason why we want to train, is not only do we want to stress the body, improve our skills and our physical capacities, but from a hormonal perspective, we want to try to be improving our profile across the session from pre to post. That's one of our goals.
Right. It's about chronically improving the athlete and finding the best opportunities at which to do that.
So we've spoken about the salivary testosterone responses to the stress test. Then we then go on to the cycling peak power responses to the PAP stimulus. This here highlighted that the power testing at the baseline mirrored the salivary testosterone results, a similar theme. Peak power on day 14 exceeded day 7 and day 21 results, with elites also producing more peak power than the non-elite athletes. In all PAP trials, so they're the trials where they did the leg press 3x3 at 90% of 1RM, positive changes in peak power occurred from baseline, whereas the control treatments had no significant effect. And when you actually have a look at the graph here, Joe, do you want to go into this?
They've actually, you see what the controls, they've actually got a tiny decrease, probably an insignificant decrease, but it's just, to me, it's a note of the direction of the change, is that there's actually a negative peak power change in the direction there without the PAP. So it's not just that you're improving with the PAP, it's also that you're preventing the decline that you would have without the PAP.
And this was for groups data. So initially did everything grouped. And then when you actually split the elite versus the non-elite, we saw that the peak power response by the elite group showed about a 7% or about a 30 watt improvement, whereas the non-elite, they had about a 4% or around a 10% change in the peak power.
We see a much greater ability of elite athletes to respond positively to PAP. Whereas for the non-elite athletes, I think they either don't know how to apply it correctly or their bodies aren't capable of utilizing it. And very well, it could be that the sub-elite athletes' bodies simply can't tolerate the additional volume of doing that. Rather than being a potentiating stress, it's almost a fatiguing stress, or maybe not necessarily fatiguing in this case, but certainly less potentiating if you look at fatigue to potentiation on a continuous spectrum. So finally, when we're looking at all these measures combined, we see that basal salivary testosterone was positive related at p less than 0.001 to both measures of motivation among elite and non-elite women. These associations were stronger in the former group, the non-elite women. Additional relationships were identified in the non-elite group, linking pre-test salivary testosterone and the salivary testosterone changes to the corresponding measures of cycling peak power. But these were weak associations. It is also important to note that, apart from the basal salivary testosterone and motivation, the paired variables were all collected at different times of the day.
Now, Jared, there's lots of really good graphs and tables here. Just before we go on to the final points about the paper, is anything else you want to bring up?
Talking about how good the graphs and whatnot are, I get this is another one. I'm really genuinely serious. Pull up the article, guys. I recognize people are listening to something for the information of it, but it's another way to really absorb that information. This article isn't just a wall of text. They've got great figures in here, great tables, really explaining quite coherently what has happened. And there's a lot happening in this paper. There's a lot of information. They've had these 4 major aims where they've compared multi-dimensionally across a very long period of time with different groups of people. It'll really help you wrap your head around it to have a look at these graphs and tables.
And then moving into the discussion, they obviously go into a lot more detail as to reasons why. Do we want to just pick out a few key pieces here for the listeners that we found quite interesting that might be worth mentioning?
Sure. I think one of the things that really popped out to me was the massive difference in the basal salivary testosterone concentrations on day 14.
So that's in that follicular phase. So day 1 to day 14 to be follicular phase, whereas from day 14 through to 28 is that luteal phase.
If you look at depiction of testosterone response across a general population, which is much more fleshed out than what we have for the elite and sub-elite, we have very clear information on how do hormones change over the course of the menstrual cycle for general population. And if you look at those graphs, you see a very clear testosterone peak right around ovulation at the end of follicular phase. But you can also see the rise in those hormones from about day 7 to day 14. And I think our theory would very much be, if you see this hormonal environment and the subsequent neuropsychological changes that occur with that as the testosterone, and I'm not as familiar with the estrogens, but I presume that they would act similarly because they've been observed to have similar behavioral changes. But we know that, or at least I know, that testosterone does bind to receptors in the amygdala and the frontal lobe, as we've discussed in previous episodes, to cause changes to the emotional state and the rational thinking of the athlete, respectively, that then result in behavioral changes that improve their training behavior.
Yeah, and exactly right. And when you think about things that we can actually pinpoint, behavior such as improved imagination, perception, memory, spatial abilities, social abilities, spatial skills, I think then that just leads to, when you're doing more complex technical and physical training, your female athletes are actually able to cope with the training load.
Exactly. And so I really think that we've done the training periodization, particularly the mesocycles of women, completely incorrectly, because we base them on the male systems, like a 3-1 conjugate system or something along those lines, where we should really be matching the training loads. And it's known, it's been found since 2014. People have known since 2013 that maximum force development is during ovulation, I believe. It's in the follicular phase relative to the luteal phase. And so clearly we should be doing maximum force development training in the follicular phase instead of the luteal phase. And the luteal phase should be taken as the more recovery period. The heavy training and recovery periods should be matched to the menstrual cycle.
As per usual, they go into great detail about other components that could have made the study even better, such as monitoring cortisol. We definitely know in the male cohorts that cortisol is another essential co-founder with its moderate effects demonstrated. You know, we found in some of my own work that testosterone and cortisol with the TC ratio is a really good marker of performance. However, they weren't able to use this marker as with obviously estrogen and progesterone.
So maybe one final note I'd like to say is, because there's always a counter-argument against hormones affecting training, that these changes are supposedly small and transient, which I do not believe is the case. As we've shown with elite versus sub-elite, there is clearly a chronic difference in the hormone environment of elite and sub-elite athletes. This is not a short-term thing. It was observed in this study across 3 months that these women had at least twofold the testosterone of the sub-elite group. And also, these are not small changes. These are not small differences. Although these numbers haven't been determined in women what constitutes a biologically significant change. In men, it's been determined that a 90% change is biologically significant.
In testosterone.
For testosterone, yes, thank you. And so clearly, these women have a biologically significantly greater testosterone, both during day 14 and for elite groups. It's biologically significant. And from my understanding, although I don't have an article to pull up immediately for this, but my understanding is that women are actually much more sensitive to changes in testosterone. And I may be thinking of that in a absolute value because of the relatively lower testosterone to males, but I do believe relatively they also have a greater sensitivity to testosterone. And if anything, people are obsessed with testosterone in men, but if anything, I think we need to be more interested in the effects of testosterone and estrogens that have similar behavioral effects in women than we are in men, because I think those things actually have a greater effect in women than men.
Yeah, it's also important to note here that these were contraceptive-free women, and it's also been shown that women on certain contraceptives, that they can actually affect testosterone response, changes in aerobic power outputs and so forth. So there's lots of really good work done out there by other researchers previously and also currently. It's probably a good topic at present. However, I think as a strength and conditioning coach or also as a female athlete, it's really important for us to understand this and talk to our athletes. It's one of the things that I do now with female athletes. I talk about their menstrual cycles, how they're feeling, and try to put some simple interventions into place with them to enable them to better cope during 28-day training cycle, incorporating something as simple as this.
Right. I sometimes forget about the stigma aspect of this, that some people are uncomfortable speaking about it. honestly, I think that just comes from people being concerned about being exposed to their own ignorance on the topic. And for those people, it's very easy to educate yourself on these things. You have Google, just go on and have a quick read. What's a follicular phase? What's a luteal phase? What is ovulation? And just educate yourself a little bit, 20 minutes, and you can feel much more confident speaking on these topics.
And as a male strength coach, always asking a female becomes a little difficult initially. However, when you explain the reason as to why you're asking the question, and then if you're able to give them the reason, it's going to help their training and their competition and their preparation, I think they understand that and they're more willing to give that information. Actually pretty much all females that I've spoken to are reasonably open with it, and they can actually help me out a fair bit with the information they're able to give me.
Right, exactly. Just taking a sensible, polite, professional approach is always the best way. And I think it is commonly noted. And so right here, it says in this article that there's scientific evidence that women often exhibit more interest in keeping resources, a higher libido, more energy and competitiveness as they progress towards ovulation, days 13 to 15. And it's also been observed that there's greater striving towards social status, which for an athlete is athletic achievement and therefore motivation to train.
Great paper. I know we've obviously reviewed it. However, I do think it's worthwhile getting it out and having a read and digging a bit deeper. Once again, especially if you're a coach out there dealing with female athletes, it's worthwhile educating on this paper, but also the background behind it.
Right. This one is definitely one of the ones that it's worth pulling up the paper and really having a read of this one.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Joe, for your time.
And thank you, Chris. Thank you, listeners. Thank you, eliteform.com. Thank you, Tristan.
And tune in next week.